You're listening to a special podcast-only episode of Agriculture Today, featuring the keynote presentation made at last week's Women Managing the Farm Conference in Manhattan, Kansas. Dr. Jason Lusk provided the keynote presentation titled The Food Police on Thursday, February 7th, to open the annual conference, which is co-sponsored by K-State Research and Extension. The presentation is based on his book of the same name and argues that the U.S. food system is being redesigned in ways that ignore the realities facing most consumers and farmers. He says the food elite in America have caused food prices to rise beyond the means of low-income consumers and harmed efforts to use emerging technologies in the food industry. Lusk is a distinguished professor and head of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. He earned his bachelor's degree in food technology and his Ph.D. in agricultural economics from Kansas State University. Here's his keynote presentation in its entirety, which we're sharing with his permission.
Thank you all for having me here, and thank you all for braving the weather to get here. That was exciting. It's always great to be back in Manhattan, particularly when we have basketball games like we did the other day. And I owe a lot to this place and the school, my degree, number one, but also I picked up a wife when I moved to Kansas, so that was also a good thing too. So she was a little upset that I got to come back to Manhattan and she was not able to come. So I have to admit to you all, I was a little nervous when I got an invitation to talk to, a women managing the farm conference. And so I asked my 13-year-old son yesterday morning, I said, what do you think I should talk to about this women's group? And he said, well, I don't know, maybe equal pay for equal farm work? And I was shocked. I didn't realize he paid attention to like these, social movements. At least as far as I know, they aren't, citing, winter wheat prices by gender yet. So I think, that's one good thing about a commodity market, I suppose. I noticed you've got a great program here today. You've got a lot of good practical advice that you'll hear. And I know that people involved in agriculture have to wear lots of hats. You have to wear a hat as an agronomist, a hat as a meteorologist, as a veterinarian. And sometimes, for many of you in this room, I know as a financial manager. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle, worked on a lot of farms. Normally it was the men in the family telling me to go move the grain cart or go hoe this field or move the tractor here or there, fix this flat tire. But one thing I often noticed is that the person giving me the paycheck at the end of the week was the woman in the family. So I know one of the hats that many of you also wear is financial strategic manager and accountant. And so thank you for those the hard work that you do. I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a story. A few years ago, I had the great pleasure to do a sabbatical in Paris. These are my two boys many years ago. They wouldn't be caught dead in those hats now today. But those of you that have been to Paris know they have some really fantastic department stores. And the one that was closest to our apartment was the one on the bottom. It's called Bon Marché. And we had moved there, got settled into this apartment, and we wanted something to eat. And we thought it would be fun to go to this department store because in addition to the fancy clothes and perfume, they also had a huge food hall that we had read about. We thought this would be a great way to have our first meal in town. So we walked over there, and this place was absolutely amazing. There were, this is a coffee section. There were, really a wall of cheeses about as, wide as that wall is long. And so I'm walking around and my jaws sort of dropped on the floor, being amazed at all these different options we had available to us. And I turned around and looked at my wife, Christy, and she was kind of starting to tear up. And I said, what's wrong? And she was just overwhelmed. You see, first of all, we couldn't read French, so we just needed like some cheddar cheese for our Triscuits. We didn't know what to do with all these cheeses we had never heard of. And I suspect she was also thinking about the fact we had to lug all these groceries back home and up 5 flights of stairs where there was no elevator. But, when I think about that situation and the way that my wife, Christy, reacted is it's really interesting in the historical context of things. Traditionally, the problem hasn't been, how do I choose among these thousands of amazing options? But rather, the biggest challenge throughout most of humanity is, am I going to have enough to eat? And the reality is we all face this kind of abundance here at home. One time when I was in Walmart, I just counted the number of different options of bread that were available in Walmart, and it was over 100. So the reality is that we all have this kind of abundance available to us. It's just that it's so common, we don't even notice it anymore. So it takes us getting out of our comfort zone in some place that we can't speak the language to really realize sometimes this amazing food abundance that we have available to us. But as I mentioned, it hasn't always been that way. Many of you are probably familiar with this guy, Thomas Malthus, and he was writing the late 1700s, and he expressed this problem that many of us know as the Malthusian concern. And the problem is he looked around at the world he saw and saw that population wasn't increasing at a seeming exponential rate. He was from Britain, so he lived on the island, and what he noticed is we have a fixed amount of land. If we keep adding more people, more workers to this fixed amount of land, we're going to have this economic concept called diminishing returns kick in, that the extra amount of food available per worker will eventually fall. And so his worry was you end up with this really big population of people sitting on the verge of starvation. So what do we do about this problem? This Malthusian concern has been around for at least articulated since at least 300 years. Well, one answer that some people give is population control. And indeed, there's some countries like China, they had a one world policy that was explicitly aimed at this. I think for a lot of us, it doesn't feel, population control feels kind of strange. I suspect part of it is because if the population that we're wanting to control is some far off place, that's okay. But if it's our son or daughter or grandparent, that population we don't want to control, right? And so I think for a lot of us, it kind of has a distasteful tone to it. Of course, you can get more output, more food, if you add more inputs. So more land, more labor, more water, you can get more output. But the challenge that we face a lot today is we actually want to be using less of those things. We want to use less water. We want to get, less labor sometimes in agriculture. And it's not like we have a more land, particularly in the United States, we can bring into production. So, the solution then that I think often we've turned to is to try to be more innovative. Get more out of what we have. So, one way of saying this is to try to increase productivity, and one of the ways we can do that, hopefully, is by doing ag research and adopting new technologies that can help us get more using less. So, back to my graph here. So, I am a college professor, so sorry to bore you. I had to give you a couple of graphs here. But what does that mean in terms of the previous story? It's not that we escape this diminishing returns problem. It's just that if we can figure out ways to get more using less, to make that labor, that extra worker more productive, give them a tractor, give them a spray rig, give them some genetics that are more productive, then we can get more food for that same amount of workers. So we can shift up to a new curve, but eventually that'll kick into diminishing returns. So we keep having to shift that curve out so that we can figure out ways to get more using less. And indeed, if you look at the data, we've been very successful at doing that. So this Malthusian concern really has not come to bear. This is calorie availability in a variety of different places across the world since the 1960s. And what you see is that most places, there's actually a lot more calories available now than there was in the 1960s per person. So this is exactly the opposite of the Malthusian prediction. He says there's going to be less food available per worker. Across the world, about 30% more calories available. And indeed, for a lot of us, the problem is not enough calories, but we probably have too many sometimes. And if you look at data, this is U.S. data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, what you see over the last about 60 or 70-year time period is we're producing about 200%, almost 200% more food today than we did in the late 1940s. But we're actually doing it using less land and a whole lot less labor. So again, exactly the opposite of the Malthusian problem. We have figured out some way to get a lot more food, but in a way that we're making more judicious use of our resources. This might be a little hard for you to see, but I did want to mention it. This was from a graph I had in an article in the New York Times a couple of years ago to try to articulate what it really means to be more productive. Because I think sometimes you can look at yields and graphs like I showed you before, and it's hard to really get a sense of what it means in terms of scale and magnitude of the productivity increases. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine let's take dairy, for example. Let's imagine we wanted to eat as a country the same amount of dairy that we actually consumed last year, but we wanted to do it using 1950s technology. And by 1950s technology, I basically mean the amount of milk per cow. How many more cows would we need to do that? So again, same amount we actually consume, but we want to do it using 1950s technology. And the answer up there you can see is we need 30 million more dairy cows if we wanted to do that. There's only 9 million dairy cows in the U.S. roughly right now. So we'd have to roughly triple the number of dairy cows to actually, consume the actual amount of dairy we actually had, all the yogurt and cheese and milk, if we were stuck on the 1950s, milk per cow. So think about what that means. That means all those cows are not, we're not having to deal with the manure or what to do with that. It's not carbon emissions that come from those cows. They don't have the water they had to drink, all the fertilizer to grow the crops to feed those cows. All those things we saved because we figured out ways to be more productive. You can see the other statistics for corn, soybeans. So take wheat, for example. We want to consume the same amount of, wheat, bread, bakery products that we actually consumed last year, but we wanted to do it using 1950s yields. We would need roughly to more than double the number of acres of wheat, acres devoted to wheat. So that's, I think, again, it's absolutely amazing the kinds of productivity gains that we've seen. So one way to kind of summarize this is this cartoon that I found on the internet, and you can see there's a big bomb, this population bomb that hit, but these scientists are looking at it and saying, well, it didn't explode. So the world is much more populated now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, yet we've figured out a way to feed people and by and large feed people well. So you might be wondering, what is the reaction of today's sort of current thinkers about food and agriculture? One reaction you might think is that they can look at these concerns people have expressed over the years and see that we've really risen to the challenge and being able to feed people. So one reaction you might have expected is people might think whoo, that was a close one, right? We averted this Malthusian problem. But really, when you look at a lot of today's popular food writing, the biggest reaction is not we should be grateful, but rather the most common thing that you'll read in a lot of the food writing in the popular press is that our food system is broken. And it's a view that's fairly common in what's the sort of loose collection of people in what's called the food movement, and it's not a single thing, but it's sort of a set of best-selling authors, a whole bunch of NGOs, non-government organizations, new labels. Even our former First Lady put a garden in the White House. And there's nothing wrong with these movements. I don't want to say that there's something nefarious necessarily here. And indeed, there's a lot of positive things we can say about this food movement. I know you've got a session here on organic agriculture. And one of the positive things we can certainly say is it's created some entrepreneurial opportunities for people to make a little more by catering to some niche markets that have perhaps some higher margins. It's also a movement that's encouraged people to use the power of their wallets and sometimes even the power of their own backyards to get what they want out of the food system. So all those are very positive developments, I think. I think one of the challenges with some of this food movement, though, is it's a movement that's often very critical of conventional production agriculture, and in particular the technologies that enable that productivity growth that we've seen today. And so I think that's sort of the aspect of this that I want to touch on and think about. How do we communicate in a world where there's a lot of debate about food and agriculture? So one of the good things about working in food and ag is it's on people's minds. People want to know what's in their food, and so we're being invited to be into a conversation, but it can be a very difficult one to have. And so how can we talk productively about some of these technologies that I think have been really critical in being able to feed humanity, while also, catching some of the positive sides of this movement. And to, I think, really highlight the challenge of this conversation, I'll show you this graph. So for years, I'll show you some data later too. For years, I've been doing a survey of 1,000 U.S. food consumers every single month. And I ask a bunch of different questions. But one month, I asked the consumers, what do you think is your biggest challenge in food and agriculture? And they could tell me anything they wanted to. But then I followed it up with this question you can see, and I said, well, okay, given whatever you said was the most important challenge, how is the most effective way of addressing that challenge? And I gave people just two options, either a more technological system, more innovation, more science, or a more natural system, more local, organic, unprocessed. And you can see what people chose. So somebody that happens to work in agricultural science and technology and innovation, this is probably one of the most depressing research results I think I've ever generated. Now, again, it doesn't have to be either or. We have a big food system. We can have a lot of different kinds of production agriculture. But I do think this slide is revealing and telling us how people think about the solutions to their current food and ag problems and what the answers to those are, and the difficulty we have about discussing particularly innovation on the production ag side. So, one of the reasons I think that there is a challenge in talking about food and ag is something that you all know here, but there's just less of a connection with the production side of agriculture. So this is data on number of farms over time. And so you go back to before the 1950s or so, there were between 6 and 7 million farms in this country. Today, there are about 2 million. But the way the USDA counts a farm is you're a farm if you have more than $1,000 in sales, in potential sales. So if a cow, walked across your lawn, you might be a farm. So really, if we look at the farms that really are, in commercial agriculture that farm for a living, what you find there is that there's only about 7.5% of those farms produce 80% of the value of ag output. So if you put that in terms of numbers, it's about 160,000 farms. That's a small number of people. The population of the U.S. is 330 million, roughly, but 160 are working in kind of large-scale production agriculture. So what's the chance when somebody runs across an article that is say critical of a modern ag or says that our food system is broken? Who are you going to go to check with or to learn about what's really happening? Well, you go back 50 years ago, good chance either you were on the farm, you had a cousin, an aunt, uncle, in my case, my grandparents, you would go ask them questions. But today, we just don't have that kind of connection. And of course, I think that's one of the big challenges here. The other flip side of this, too, is because of these productivity gains that I talked about, it's made food much more affordable for people. So this is the percentage of our income that we spend as a country on food. So you go back to about 100 years ago, we were spending about a quarter of our income on food. Today, it's only about 10%. So, the good thing about this is it leaves 90% of our income to spend on all the other things we enjoy in life, like getting to go to basketball games or, getting to have an iPhone or iPad or whatever, all those things we can afford to do now because we can, more affordably meet one of the basic necessities of life. But I think one of the things it's also done is it's enabled us to demand more out of our food system. When you're spending a smaller percentage of your income on food, it frees up that income to demand new things that perhaps you didn't before. So how can we talk about this, I think, and engage in fruitful conversations? Well, I think there is a sense in which, I'll talk about this in a minute, that we just need to educate people. But I think what I'm here to tell you is that this actually is not a problem that's going to go away. There are no silver bullets, I think, in engaging in some of these contentious issues around food and ag. And I know there's a lot up here, but hopefully I can make some sense of it for you. So one way I think about this is this old Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing. I don't know if you had to do this, but when I was in 4-H as a kid, I had to learn this hierarchy of needs that sort of suggests you got to start at the bottom. Once you meet your basic needs of food and shelter, then you can move up the ladder and start worrying about some other things, like what kind of car am I driving? And then at the very top, there's a self-actualization, like, do you like me? That kind of stuff. And some people have suggested there's a similar kind of hierarchy of needs with regard to just food itself. So I just put some questions up there about, at the very bottom of that, if you don't have enough calories to eat, that's all you're going to worry about. And it's only once you get enough calories that you can start worrying about other things like, is this food safe to eat? Then you can start thinking a little bit more about the future. Okay, I've got enough right now. What am I going to do for the food tomorrow? Then you can worry about how does this taste? The problem I talked about at the very beginning. How do I choose among all these options? And you can keep working yourself up all the way to the top, where you start worrying about things like what does this food say about who I am as a person? Sort of symbolic meaning of food. And there's this nutritionist, Elizabeth Sater, that talked about this, and she argued there's this pinnacle at the top. She called these food needs at the very top, once you can kind of reach up to the top, instrumental food needs. And she said about those instrumental food needs, that's a quote you can see on your right there. She said, these foods are consumed to achieve a desired physical, cognitive, or spiritual outcome. These instrumental reasons may or may not be rational or supported by scientific inquiry. No kidding, right? If you've paid attention to any of the food debates of recent years. Okay, so that's nothing necessarily new about that per se, but the thing I want to layer on top of that are the couple of words on the left-hand side of the screen, and that is, as a country over the last 40 or 50 years, those slides that I showed you before, we've been moving up this triangle. And say as a country, when we weren't as well fed, we were sort of at the bottom of this triangle, and my argument is that when you're in that sort of state of the world, that there's probably fairly broad agreement about what it means for those needs to be satisfied. So people are thinking, are we going to have enough food to eat? Make sure there's food in our table. Most people, you may disagree about the way you get there, the policies, but you can probably agree this is, what it means to be well fed. But my argument is, as a country, as we've sort of moved up this pinnacle and this hierarchy of needs sort of towards the top, I don't think there's any necessarily any reason we would expect people to agree on what the good food is at the top. If we're talking about your spiritual values, your view of who you are as a person, there's no reason we would expect each other to agree on some of those issues. Nor am I, just me saying I think this kind of food is good and you whatever. We don't have a basis for agreement there. So I think in some ways this is a little bit of a depressing picture, but I think it's the reality that because we are well-fed and we're up at the top of this pinnacle, there's likely to be and continue to be a lot of disagreements about what the good food system is. So how can we communicate with people? So this is the other hat that I mentioned before that I'm going to encourage you to think about wearing on your own farm hat is you're also a publicist and a communicator on your farm in addition to all those other hats that I talked about before. So our old model of communicating when we wanted to talk about, say, production, agriculture, or anything else is this one, what I call the old information deficit model. And the basic idea here is that people are out there. We want them to believe the same thing we believe. We just give them information. You have the sage on the stage, the experts. The information flows down and people just believe what they hear. So the mental image here is that people are like a bucket. We just turn on the water, fill them up with the knowledge we want them to have, and they'll believe everything we do. So this is the way the world works, right? Of course not. But how many times have you been in a group or perhaps even said yourself when you hear about something that consumers believe, I know David talked about the Super Bowl. We saw some corn syrup ads on there. So you want to talk to people about something like that. Often what you hear people say is, "Well, we just need to educate people." And when people say that, I think the mental model they have in their mind is this one: we just got to fill people up with the information I have, and they'll believe the same thing as me. But I think we all know that's probably a little bit naive. So a different way of thinking about this communication challenge emerged in the 1980s or so through a bunch of psychologists. This is from an academic paper in the late 1980s. And the psychologists, what they noticed is there were a whole bunch of new technologies at the time that were coming about, whether it was nuclear energy, DNA, GMOs, microwaves, that the experts were saying were safe. Food irradiation would be another one. But the public said, I don't buy it. And so the psychologists were trying to understand, well, what causes this gap between what the scientists, the experts believe, and what the public believes. And they came up with this model here, and they classified potential risks or new technologies into two dimensions. The kind of y-axis there is how new of a risk is this? And what they found is that the more novel something is, the riskier people perceive it. And then the other axis there is how much control do people feel like they have over this risk? And so the more control we feel like we have, often those things don't feel as risky to us. So the things up in this upper right-hand quadrant are the things that we perceive as being very risky. If they're relatively new and things we feel like we don't have any control over. So just to give you an example here, you can see there's automobiles down here. The reason I picked this one out is objectively, probably one of the riskiest things we do every day is get in the car and drive, particularly today out on some of those icy roads. So be careful going home. But you just look at statistics on injuries and deaths. Driving a car is super risky. People don't perceive it as risky. Why? Cars have been around a long time, and we at least feel some degree of control. Of course, some crazy person may run into us, but we perceive we have some control over those, so we don't perceive it as being very risky. But by contrast, you see these things up here, pesticides and whatever else, people perceive as being much riskier because of this dimension. So I think this is still a very useful framework, but I think what we've noticed is, again, I point out this was from a paper in the 1980s, is that there's a lot of these things people still perceive as very risky, even though they've been around for a long time, so they're not new anymore. So it can't be that it's just novelty. And certainly with regard to control, we have a lot, this food movement has offered a lot of new alternatives. So people, if you don't want to buy the conventional product, you have an organic. So people have more control than they did. So this model can't go all the way in terms of helping us understand consumers' aversion to a lot of food and ag technologies. So I think a new way of thinking about this is emerging. It's something that's called the Cultural Cognition Project. It's led by this researcher at Yale University. And one of the things he argues is that our perceptions of how risky something is, it's not just some belief that's outside of us, but it's something that we choose our beliefs in a way to conform with our social groups and identities. Like we want to fit in with the people around us. And so we conform our beliefs about these disputed matters of fact to define these identities. And it leads to things like motivated reasoning. I'm going to find reasons to believe certain things. We may not consciously think of it that way, but often we do. And probably one of his most famous results is this one that's here. He did a survey with about 1,000 U.S. citizens and asked them this question. Do you agree or disagree that there's solid evidence of global warming that's mostly due to human activities such as burning fossil fuels? So the higher up you are on that, the more likely you are to agree with that statement. Then the vertical axis is basically a measure of scientific knowledge. He gave people a big, long quiz. So people on the far right, of that are the people that, they're like the scientists in terms of their knowledge about the scientific literature. So if it was just the information deficit model, what you would expect is as people got more educated, people would start to believe the same things. But what he did is he split his sample into two groups, liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. And what you can see is actually as people got smarter, those two lines didn't get closer together, they actually diverged. So, what this tells you is that it's not knowledge. You get on the very far right-hand side of this thing, it's not that this group is smarter or less smart than that one. They're all the same level of smart. It's just that they have found ways of choosing to believe different things. One of the take-home lessons you should take from this slide is the smarter you are, the easier it is for you to fool yourself. Because you know how to go find the evidence you need to support your prior beliefs. Okay, so this is about climate change, but let me give you an example that maybe relates to food and ag. So this is obviously a map of California, and what I've done is I've taken the counties of California and shaded in the counties according to how the people in that county voted on a particular ballot initiative. So my question for you is, what ballot initiative do you think this is? So I hear a few suggestions out there. Water usage could be. Caged chickens, that's a good one. It's actually none of those. This is actually a ballot initiative about same-sex marriage. But what I want to show you, though, is I'm going to put the same-sex marriage vote right up against the GMO labeling initiative. I could have put the caged chicken ballot initiative. It would look exactly the same. So what you can see is if you lived in a county that likely voted against same-sex marriage, you're also likely to live in a county that voted against GMO labeling. And it's even stronger than this. So in this graph, I just shaded a county if more than half of the people in the county voted yes, a certain way. But if I look at the percentage of people in a county that voted, by the way, same-sex marriage was in 2008. The GMO labeling was 2012, I believe. If I plot those against each other, what I can see is there's a pretty darn strong relationship between those two things. In fact, if I take the percentage of your people that count in that county that voted on same-sex marriage in 2008, I can predict with over 70% accuracy the percentage of the people in your county that will vote a certain way on GMO labeling. Now, I suspect you must be thinking to yourself, Jason, what in the heck does same-sex marriage have to do with GMO labeling? And that's my point. Nothing, right? These two things ostensibly have nothing to do with each other, do they? So why would they be so strongly correlated? It must be that there's something else going on here, right? Well, one thing it tells us is that the debate on GMO labeling must have had very little to do with the science of GMO labeling, right? Otherwise, why would we expect votes on GMO labeling to have such strong correlations with this totally unrelated thing? I don't know the answer to why this correlation exists, but it suggests to me that there's something else going on here. There's some underlying set of, say, rural versus urban values, or some other thing that's driving both of those votes in the same way. So it does, suggest that you want to talk to somebody about, how you're going to vote on GMO labeling. It's likely not going to be a discussion that's primarily centered on the science of GMOs. It's probably going to be a discussion that's centered around people's, values about things, and that's a much more difficult conversation to have. So one way to think about those more difficult conversations, there's this book by Jonathan Haidt. It's about 10 years old now, but still a very good book that talks about what he calls moral foundations. And he argues that, so what is a moral foundation? One way to think about it is, how do I decide whether something is right or wrong? You might say, oh, that's simple. But what he argues is that there are actually different people have different ways of answering that question. And he also uses this sort of political spectrum from very liberal to very conservative. But what he argues, there's at least 5 of these foundations. There's things like, harm. Is it hurting somebody? If it hurts somebody, it's wrong. There's also things like purity. Is it contaminated or pure? Is another way of thinking about whether it's right or wrong. And one of the things he argued was that for folks that are very liberal, they mainly focus on this issue of harm and fairness as judging whether something is right or wrong. So that tells us we need different communication messages with different people. So if I want to talk to somebody about, again, say GMOs or something like that, to somebody that's very liberal, I'm going to use much more of a harm foundation. What does this do to food prices? What can you do to production agriculture in parts of the world where people don't have use of good pesticide, for example? How can these technologies help people that might otherwise be harmed by these things? It's a very different conversation than maybe folks that are very conservative, which have a much more nuanced mix of moral foundations, but that do pay more attention to things like authority. So, for example, these arguments like the National Academy of Science says that GMOs are, I didn't mean this to be a talk about GMOs, but I'm just using it as an example that an appeal to authority might work better with somebody that has a slightly different set of moral foundations. So again, just to think a little bit more about what this means in terms of the food world, I'm going to return back to some of the data I've been collecting over the years. And one of the things I ask on my surveys is the set of what I call food values. How important are a set of 12 or 13 things to you when you go to buy food? And what I find, this is just think about it as sort of a relative ranking here. What I ask people month in and month out, what we tend to find is that people tell us that taste, safety, nutrition, and price, those are the 4 things that matter a lot to people when they buy food. All these other things like appearance, naturalness, animal welfare, environment fall much further down the list. It's not that those things aren't important to people, but the way I ask this question is you have to make a trade-off. You can't tell me everything is important. And if forced to choose, people pick things like taste, safety, nutrition, and price. But one of the things that we find is that how you answer these things differs a lot according to things like income, for example. The biggest one, of course, is price. Higher income people care a lot less about price than lower income people. But the other thing I want to do is kind of convert this into some of those moral foundation kind of things that I talked about before, or this sort of cultural cognition. And it tells us, again, I think some of the challenges in discussing food, there's a lot more politics and polarization than might first meet the eye. So this is how people rank something like animal welfare. So I don't have a measure of scientific intelligence, but I just have people's education here. And then I split my group into the same 2 groups that Dan Cahan did, and that's liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. And what you can see, there's a big gap between those 2 in terms of concern for animal welfare. If you're a liberal Democrat, you're going to care a lot more about animal welfare as a food value than a conservative Republican. And again, as education increases in both these, it's not huge, but there is a widening gap there a little bit. Interestingly, this is a trend. I told you I've been doing the surveys for over 5 years now. Both of these things are trending upward for both groups. So animal welfare as a food value is something that's increasingly people are saying is more important to them. Although you can't really see the size of the axis. This is 0, so it's still less important than a lot of the other things that we talked about. I'm not going to talk about all these. This environment kind of goes the same way as animal welfare in some. Price. The one I did want to kind of focus on this one is meat demand. So this is a measure of consumers' willingness to pay essentially for meat. So for a given pound of steak, let's say, what's the most you'd be willing to pay for that? And you can see a fairly strong relationship here. This might not be surprising to you. Conservative Republicans like their meat a little more than the liberal Democrats. But what you see here that I think is particularly striking is that this, as people become more educated, this gap grows. And at the same time, you can see sort of on the bottom, the trends over time between these 2 groups is getting wider. So meat consumption is becoming a more politically polarized issue. And this shouldn't be necessarily surprising to us. Why? Well, look at the things that are in the news. So here's some data I collected with Glenn Tonsor, who's here at K-State. We just looked at things in the news that link the red line that you can see there, this is numbers of news stories over time that link the word climate change and beef. And you can see, early on, not many stories, but a huge rise there. You can't see all the rest, but things that link say, beef and fat content. So some of you probably saw this Eat Lancet report that came out a couple of weeks ago. And about a year or 2 years ago, there's also the big, bacon freak out, that bacon causes cancer, So all those kind of stories are coming out, and because I've already showed you things like climate change have this political kind of polarization to them, and then that turned around and getting linked to food, what we see is a lot of our food demand issues are also becoming more politically polarized over time. So, again, there's no good way in thinking about how to deal with these, but I do think it does suggest that there aren't going to be any silver bullets in just all of a sudden convincing consumers to believe whatever we believe about our food system. So how can we communicate with consumers about ag and food technologies? And again, I don't think there are any perfect answers here, but all I can do is tell you, well, here's how I went about it. So this is actually a more recent book that I have called Unnaturally Delicious, and I think it's really important to talk about innovations happening in food and agriculture from the perspective of the people who are using those innovations and who it's helping. Because that's the group of people that I think are often not seen in a lot of the news stories that we see. So I'm going to share with you just a few of the stories that I told in this book, and then I'll kind of wrap up. I think one of the really interesting innovations that's happening in ag, broadly speaking right now, is this sort of digital agriculture, for lack of a better word. I spent a number of years on faculty at Oklahoma State University. This was one of my neighbors in Stillwater, Oklahoma, David Waits. Back in the mid-'90s, he started this company called SST, which is a precision ag company. They were around before we even had the GPS system, so they were certainly a new entrant in here. And, many of you have technologies like yield monitors on your farm, so this is not necessarily new technology per se, but it's certainly technology that the average food consumer knows nothing about. And what's the promise here? And again, it's still some promise. It's not all of this has been realized yet, but the idea basically is there's areas of a field that are going to yield more than others. So, maybe we can cut back on some fertilizer here. Maybe we need to add a little more there, or maybe we just don't need to plant anything there and save some resources overall. But this idea about being more judicious with our input use, maybe we can cut back with fertilizer and other chemical use to help prevent some runoff into waterways or other things. And this is just, one whole suite of technologies that are now, all these sensors that are now entering the farm, I think are really interesting technologies that can help us, again, increase food production, get more food, get us out of that Malthusian trap, but also help with some of these environmental problems that a lot of people are worried about. And if we're going to talk about precision agriculture, I think, this is about as precise as it gets. So again, these were some of my colleagues at the time at Oklahoma State University that have some machines that look at the crop as you go through the field on a plant-by-plant basis. So that's about as precise as it gets, right? And these machines, those little white things, they look at the plant and decide whether it needs fertilizer or not. If it doesn't, it moves on. I know some of the students at my current university at Purdue, they've got machines now that they're robotic machines are going through the field that are looking at plants and deciding, is this one a weed or not? If it's a weed, there's a little arm that goes out and pulls the weed. Now, none of these things are commercially available or commercially viable yet, but this is the kind of stuff I think scientists are working on, and they're working on it for the same reasons that I think consumers might be concerned about them. It's not like you want to spend a lot of your resources on fertilizer and herbicides or pesticides. If you can find ways to make more judicious of those expensive inputs, you want to do that too, right? And I think one of the things that's really important, I find, in talking with food consumers is that this is something that folks at land-grant universities like Kansas State and other places have been working on for a really, really long time. So, the next time that you happen to be, for example, in Stillwater, you might look out across the road near campus and you see this historical monument. What that signifies there is a field that's been planted to continuous wheat since the 1890s, so for more than 120 years. The first professor of agriculture there wanted to run an experiment. He said, what happens if I plow up this native prairie land and just plant wheat and don't do anything else to it year on year going on indefinitely? And so, this is an experiment that is about sustainability, right? Consumers tell us about sustainability, so it's important for them to know we've been doing this stuff for like 120 years. So one interesting thing about this field, what do you think the yields on this field are, wheat yields, say, over the last 10 years versus the first 10 years? Higher or lower than they were in the 1890s? Actually higher. Why? Well, one answer is this guy. He's our wheat geneticist, was our wheat geneticist when I lived in Oklahoma, Brett Carver. So they're planting ever new varieties of wheat to that field. So one way to say that is that the gains in genetics have more than offset the losses in soil fertility. Of course, the good news is you don't have to accept those losses in soil fertility. You could add manure or fertilizers or other things back to them. But I do think it does suggest just the amazing innovation that we've seen across the sector that have helped us both increase food production, but solve some other problems as well. I think one of the biggest challenges in some of these discussions is on the topic of animal welfare. I'm going to tell a little story, though, on the topic of animal welfare. Probably about 15 years ago, when I was a younger professor, I was giving a talk out in Eastern Oklahoma. It was a Kansas-Oklahoma cattlemen's conference. And I had done the survey of food consumers about animal welfare concerns. And it was a morning like this morning. It was really cold. And I gave this whole slew about what consumers thought, was high animal welfare. And there was this one rancher in the room, and he raised his hand. He said, "Let me tell you something, mister. I had to get up at 5 this morning and chop ice so my cattle could drink. That's animal welfare." And I was like, yeah, that's right. So, but I do think this is one of the challenges and one of the things that a lot of consumers really do think about. And often the answer is, well, we want improved animal welfare, for things like, let's say, chickens or hogs that tend to live indoors. The answer often is, well, just throw the doors open, let them live outside, right? That sounds great until you have a day like today and it's freezing. The animals don't want to be out there any more than we do. Or if a coyote or a hawk happens to be around, also not very great. By the way, dying is the worst thing that can happen for animal welfare. That's like on the bad end. And so people often think about solutions to animal welfare only being of the sort of naturalistic sort. Open the barns, just let them run free. But my argument is, don't we want to use science and innovation to make sure that the changes we're adopting actually are improving the lives of our farm animals? So one example here is these, what they call these enriched colony cages that have come about. They're used a lot more in Europe. Most chickens today in the United States live in these so-called battery cages. It's a small, confined space. There's not a lot of room for the chickens, not a lot of amenities. It's very efficient in terms of producing eggs. These enriched colony cages are slightly larger. There's some nesting boxes, so the chickens can go have some privacy while they're laying their eggs. And there's a few little amenities in there, some perches they can get on, that really do, across the board, by most metrics, improve animal welfare, but do it in an affordable way. It is more expensive, but not nearly as expensive as some of the, say, cage-free systems. And of course, there's some Dutch researchers working on these really fancy things that, this is like the Ritz-Carlton of chicken living, if you really want to, afford it. But again, science-based innovations in food and ag. I'll give you a couple more examples, and then I'll stop. Let's talk about, I mentioned GMOs for a minute, and I think for most consumers, that word is sort of a dirty word. Most people don't know what it means, but they do know it's something to be a little skeptical of, and probably one of the reasons is often associated with these sort of big, bad, evil food companies and agribusinesses, supposedly big, bad, and evil. So one of the things I wanted to talk about this technology, but how can you do it in a way that's perhaps, doesn't get people's, feathers ruffled up? And one way I tried to do that is by telling the story of these students. These are some college students at UC Davis. They won a competition. There's this competition held every year at MIT. It's called iGEM, Internationally Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. And most of these students, it's student projects. They're mainly genetically engineering yeast or bacteria to do interesting things. These students are from California, and they looked around at their state and tried to see a problem they could help address. And California apparently is trying to increase its olive industry. Now, I didn't realize this, but at least according to these students, when I talked to them, they told me that most of the olive oil that we buy in the grocery store comes over from Europe on a boat. And by the time it gets to us, it's stale. And they did a little taste test with some consumers here. They had consumers tasting the stale, rancid olive oil and fresh olive oil. What do you think most consumers preferred? They actually preferred the stale. Why? Because it's what we're so accustomed to eating, we don't know what the good stuff is even supposed to taste like. But one of the things they tried to figure out, that the science for testing, staleness was expensive and sort of a laborious process, particularly for, small olive producers. So one of the things they did is they, interestingly enough, genetically engineered a bacteria that when it came into contact with the chemicals that produce these stale off flavors, it would send off a signal. And that signal could then be read by an electronic monitor that someone could hold. So I think this is really interesting. It's a GMO. It's not a GMO in the food, though. It's just testing the food. And it's kind of hard to look at these kids and say they're a bunch of evil, agribusinesses that are doing something nefarious, right? They're just trying to improve their agricultural industry in the state that they happen to live in. So I think these sorts of examples are one that are much more palatable for the average food consumer to think about. And lastly, I think there's all kinds of really interesting innovations, not just on the farm, but also they're likely to hit our kitchen. So there's the 3D food printers that many of you have probably heard about. There's all the various forms of lab-grown meat. I could give you an hour-long talk about that, so I won't. But I think one of the most interesting innovations there is a company that's out of London. I talked to their CEO. It's a robotics company, and they envision this future kitchen where you will have robotic arms attached above your cooktop stove that can do all the cooking for you. And in fact, what they did is they got the winner of one of those celebrity chef cooking competitions in the UK, brought him on board, had him cook a meal, and while he was cooking, they attached all these computer sensors to his arms that would record all of his movements. And then what they can do then is attach take those same readings and then program those computer arms to exactly replicate the movements of that celebrity chef's arms. So imagine you've had a hard day at work, maybe you were out on the grain cart with some of those hand signals being thrown at you, whatever it might happen to be, but you're worn out, you get home, you don't want to cook, you just go into your kitchen, you select your favorite chef, maybe it's Martha Stewart, Bobby Flay, whatever. You can literally have their arm movements, going in your kitchen. So, will we get there anytime in the near future? I don't know, but I think, it's all these kind of innovations that are coming on down the food system. I think there's a lot of really exciting innovations, so potentially very disruptive innovations that could change a lot of the way we do agriculture. But I think it's an exciting time to be in food and agriculture. The thing I want to leave you with is just to encourage you to engage with people. People want to be talking about food and agriculture today. I think particularly as women in agriculture, you're particularly well suited to have some of those conversations about food and agriculture. And so I encourage you to do that. You're being talked about. You might as well be a part of the conversation. So thank you for having me here today, and I'll stop if I don't know if I have time for questions, but I'll be hanging around if you want to ask a question or two.